Right now on WUSA9 Plus, we are bringing you special live coverage of the No Kings rally. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Larry Miller.
And I'm Marcella Robertson. Those rallies are aimed at President Donald Trump's policies, the higher cost of living, and the war with Iran. Events and marches are planned in all 50 states, many of them underway right now.
Yeah, and right here in the DMV, Washington is once again at the center of a major national moment. Crowds are expected in and around the city, including a march in D.C. across Memorial Bridge and a larger rally near the National Mall as protesters call attention to concerns over democracy, civil rights, immigration, and of course, executive power as well. Let's get to Sarah Robinson. She is joining us right now in Germantown. She's been out there for the past couple of rallies, including one in Prince George's County. Sarah, give us a sort of update of what's going on right now. What are you seeing? What are people telling you?
Well, Larry, this protest here is pretty packed. I want to show you exactly what we're looking at right now. There are hundreds of people here, and I should emphasize that this is really just one location. As you mentioned, in Maryland, there are multiple locations. We actually just came from a different No Kings rally. That was in Riverdale Park, Maryland. Right now we are in Germantown, and we've talked to a lot of people here. They feel very passionately. This is the third No Kings Day rally or protest that they've gone to, and at this one we have really heard about three key issues over and over again that people say they're coming out to protest. One is the war in Iran, the other immigration, and then the economy. I've actually spent some time talking to people here today. This is Sherry. Hi, Sherry. I am doing well. Thank you for speaking with me. I wanted to ask you about what specifically brought you out here today.
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that I love the passion and energy that's here. I mean, people care, and that's a good thing. I have a personal situation. One of my loved ones, someone very close to her, was detained by ICE and deported. This is a person who never committed a crime in his life, and I am aware of the way he was treated, and I can tell everybody that no one would want a loved one treated the way he was treated. So it's the immigration thing. The other thing that means a lot to me, I worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs for 36 years. I know firsthand the price of war. It's very high. And the fact that we are going into a war like we're going into the kitchen to cook dinner is very meaningful to me, and I care a lot about it. So I do think things like this are very important. I love, as I said, I love the passion. People really do care, and that's a good thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Sherry. And we have heard similar sentiments from a lot of people at these protests. You can probably hear some honking behind me as people are driving by. They are honking their horns. People here are asking them to do that to show their support. Now, there are marches also happening. So if you are in the Germantown area and in other parts of Maryland, you're definitely going to want to pay attention to traffic patterns as well. There are a lot of pedestrians on the street and also people slowing down on the roadways to stop and say hello to these protesters. So that is something really important and to be mindful of. But we're going to be out here for the next several hours. This location, they are planning to be out here for a while as well. So for now, I'll hand it off back to you guys in the studio.
And Sarah, I want to ask you, have we seen any counter protesters out there at this point? I know it's still early on, but what have you seen so far on that end?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, we have heard about counter protesters, but our team has not seen any at this location, and we've been driving around Maryland. We had about a 40-minute drive from Riverdale Park, Maryland, to this location in Germantown, and we did not see any counter protesters. We did drive under some underpasses, or overpasses, I should say, and there were a lot of protesters up there as well. But so far, all of them have been No Kings Day protesters, and we haven't seen anything else other than that.
You know, Sarah, I think this certainly begs the question in terms of really what's the plan here. We have these demonstrations and have had these No King demonstrations take place before. What is the plan to see the change that they're asking for?
Well, we did hear from people today who want people to register to vote. That is the next step. And in Maryland, there is a primary coming up on June 23rd. So we have seen several signs and posters of people kind of initiating that, getting them to sign up to make sure that they're registered to vote, and then making sure that they're actually voting. I think that is the next, there's a sign right in front of me. I think if we can zoom in on that, that one says protect voting rights. That is another thing that people are really passionate about today. They want to make sure that people are voting and expressing their opinion on these key issues, and that they're not just stepping up once in a while to protest, but they're actually doing something about it that will incite that real change.
Activism attached to policy creates change in this country. Sarah Robinson, we appreciate the update. Thank you so much. All right, to help us get a bit more context about the moment, we're joined by Scott Warren, a fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University.
And Warren leads work focused on building pro-democracy, a conservative agenda in the U.S. with a particular focus on election trust, on how Americans think about democracy and political identity. So let's start with the big picture. I appreciate you being with us. What is the big picture here? What do the rallies tell you really about the political moment in this country?
Thanks so much for having me. A pleasure to be here. And yeah, I mean, I was just listening into your coverage, and obviously there are millions of people across the country that are showing up in big cities and small cities to show how they feel about this administration. I think the fact that this is the third time that these rallies are happening says something. I also think that the devil is going to be in the details in terms of, as you all were saying, what happens from here. I think the fact that people are organizing on the streets is symbolically important. What needs to happen for change to occur is that this has to turn into a constituency that mobilizes beyond just protest days every few months, and actually takes action on specific issues. And I think the other thing that probably is important with these protests is how much of this is an anti-Trump protest and how much of it is about bigger issues pertaining into democracy in this country. And I think we'll see sort of how that plays out. So the fact that there's so many people protesting shows a lot, but there's still a lot that has to happen for these protests to translate into real action.
So, Scott, piggybacking off of that idea about democracy, from what we've heard from the demonstrators there, this go around and the last was that they believe that there is a real existential threat to democracy at this point. Is that a legitimate concern based on the actions of the Trump administration up until this point?
I think that you're seeing a lot of indices demonstrate that democracy in this country is backsliding. You just had Freedom House come out with a report saying that U.S. democracy is on the downswing, as did a report called VDEM. And so you're seeing some of these objective reports come out and say that that democracy is on a downward swing. And I think that there have been actions that the Trump administration has taken that suggest a high degree of executive overreach, that suggests that they're not listening or really trying to work through Congress. And so I do think that there is a need for protesters and this is hard to do in this moment in time, but to distinguish between what are factors that might actually demonstrate that democracy is at risk, and what's policy that people don't like. And I think that's always something that's a little bit challenging. Deportations are something that the executive government can engage in. How they're engaging in these deportations is probably something that is beyond the pale in terms of our democracy. You're seeing similar things with the war in Iran. Going to war without congressional assent is something that is problematic. It's something that other administrations have done. But I think that democracy in this country has been declining for a number of years now. And the Trump administration seems to be a byproduct of that. And so getting a little bit more specific in terms of what that means is important. That said, I know people are in the streets. They're not going to get very nuanced in terms of what that means. But I think that the distinction between we don't like this policy and democracy is at risk is always important to think about.
And Scott, as we have you up here, we're also looking at footage from protests here across the country. A major turnout here. I think the big question for a lot of people is, how do you take that momentum and how do you actually turn it into policy change? Midterm elections coming up. And I think that is really what a lot of people are asking, is how do you take that momentum and keep it going?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen a lot of countries when this happens, when people are upset and they're protesting what they feel is democracy backsliding and eroding. This translates into real sustained action. Sometimes you see general strikes. You saw some of that in Minnesota when you had the ICE raids happening there. So what's taking, protests on the streets to actions that actually make it somewhat uncomfortable to go about everyday life? I think that's one thing that we'll see if that happens. This is actually translate into real sustained action. The other thing is you need these actions to translate into to real constituencies. I think a good amount to ask for people to protest on a Saturday, but are they going to organize in their communities? Are they going to campaign for folks that they want to win? Voting is one part of that I saw in the previous segment, but it's so much more than that. And so I think that one risk of this is, are you just asking people to come back and back and back to protest? Are they going to see change? How are you actually mobilizing people in their communities? And so I'm curious how much the protest organizers are thinking about that in terms of actually creating a constituency behind this that's not just about the Democratic Party, but about beyond that, versus, we're going to have the next No Kings protest in another 6 weeks. I think the organizers have to figure out how they get beyond these protests, which are, you see these images and it's quite consequential. But if you look at throughout history, if you look at the March on Washington, that was part of something bigger. The sense of this being part of something bigger, and not just a Never Trump rally, but part of something that has a real constituency. It'll be interesting to see if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be tied to policy. And what we've yet to hear from anyone associated with this group or others is what specifically are you going to do on the policy front to see this agenda through in the way in which you've described. I want to get to a little bit of your work, because you do a lot of work on pro-democracy conservatives. In a moment like this, I think where we're talking about trying to find common ground, which I don't think we've seen in months now up until this point, is there still room for common ground? Is that a thing of the past at this point? What's your estimation?
I mean, I not to be quaint about it, but I think that there are a lot of people in this country across the political spectrum that really do believe in small d democratic principles. A lot of the work that I'm doing is going around to states across the country, working with folks across the ideological spectrum, but including conservatives, Republican secretaries of state, Republican election administrators that are very focused on how do we ensure that we have free and fair elections in 2026, which I know is something that people are concerned about. The Trump administration has talked about federal overreach of elections. The SAVE Act is up in Congress. I think that bedrock principle of one person, one vote, ensuring that elections work is something that people across the country really do believe in. I also think, and again, not trying to be pedantic, but this is the 250th year anniversary of the country. There's an opportunity here to demonstrate what are American values and principles that we hold dear. And one of them is freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And so, I think these rallies are a byproduct of that. But I've met a lot of people across the political spectrum that really do want to get to a better place, that really do want to get, across this division. But it's gonna take work to get there. And it's going to take less demonizing of our political opponents. We've done some research at Johns Hopkins that shows that over 50% of Democrats and over 50% of Republicans don't just disagree with the opposite political party, but they see them as evil. It's going to be hard to make progress irrespective of protests and action if we see fellow Americans as fundamentally evil. And so figuring out how we get beyond that is going to be incredibly important, and is going to take more work than showing up to No Kings rallies.
And you have spent a lot of time focusing on protests, how they affect confidence in democracy. For viewers watching all these rallies unfold today, seeing the outcome, what is the big difference here between those healthy democratic dissent in these healthy conversations, people who disagree, and the kind of polarization that can really make institutions feel even weaker? And we know we have seen a lot of that over the last couple of years.
Well, I think part of it is polarization on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing in a democracy to disagree with one another. Where it gets bad is when you have what's called effective polarization. When you, as I was saying, demonize your political opponent, see them as less than, see them as not American. And so, even for those folks out today, they are expressing their American right to be in the streets, and that is there's a lot of countries where if you think that democracy is on the downswing here, there's a lot of countries where these protests could not happen the way they're happening today, and I think that that's something really to celebrate. I think the key is how do you bring more people into this bigger tent, this democracy bigger tent? I think it needs to be seen as fundamentally American, not really tied to the Democratic Party per se, but as part of broader principles. And again, seeing disagreement as something that is healthy, but demonization is something that is not. And I think that's something that we've lost a bit in this country as of late.
Kind of considering history a little bit, I think history would tell us that we have these moments of tension. It sort of resolves itself, and then we sort of enter yet a new era. Does it appear that sort of what we've seen in the past will sort of play out yet again, that the way in which we've seen the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement play out, all of those moments created a mountain of tension that created eventually policy that led to additional rights for women, for people of color, for the disabled? Are we potentially in that same era yet again?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, American history is one in which there's been a lot of starts and stops. There are people that say, "Oh, well, our democracy's never been as bad as it is now." We had the Civil War. We had those, the 60s where you had a high prevalency of political assassinations. And so obviously we've gotten through challenging times before. That said, this time is different, as all times are different, but this time is different just given, given technology, given the discomfort that I think people are feeling in the current moment, with things like artificial intelligence, creating this notion of what our job's going to look like. There's all these factors that are coming up at the same time. And so I think that there's definitely the hope that this moves into an era, where you sort of do have Congress working, where you have people working across differences to get things done. Where honestly, and I think administrations, and that needs to end. But I think that it takes work to get there. We can't expect that. Just because other periods of tumult in this country have resulted in progress, that this time will as well. And so the hope is that we can become stronger on the other side, and both Republicans and Democrats are fearful for the state of our democracy right now. But that's definitely not guaranteed. That's something that we'll have to fight for, and probably engage in activities that might be uncomfortable. And by that I mean engaging across difference and recognizing that we all have to live together somehow. And I think that's something that we can sometimes forget about in moments like this too.
Yeah, and I think that is a point that we can at least all agree on. When it comes to protests, movement like this, it can be hard to measure success. I think it looks different for everyone. What are you specifically going to be looking for in the days and weeks ahead to show, was this a one-day movement or protest, or something that is actually going to bring policy change, something that will see an outcome in the midterm elections?
I think you have to look at whether the people at these rallies stay engaged. I remember the women's marches after the first Trump administration, after the victory of the first Trump administration. You had about 600,000 people marching in New York City, and you had less than that voted in the New York City primaries only months later. You have to so in that case, the action wasn't translated into the policy change you all are talking about. So do these rallies, or do you see upswings in voter registration? Do you see upswings in terms of people participating? We have a primary coming up in DC for mayor and city council. People need to participate in that, and then they need to take action on issues that they care about as well. And so I think what'll be important, maybe there'll be another No Kings rally, and the extent to which you have people continue to come to that is important. But it's sort of easy to get people out the first time, easy-ish to get people out the second, third time, not as easy to get people out a fourth and fifth time, because they want to see what their action is turning into. And so the extent to which people stay engaged is going to be important. One additional point I'll make that I think has been an important part of these rallies, they have tended, and there's been research that demonstrates this, they have tended to skewer a little on the older side. And this is to take nothing away from older individuals, but young Americans right now are really frustrated and verging on cynical with politics. And they're just, the risk is that they divorce from the system entirely because they see it as not worth fighting for. These are young people that grew up during COVID, that Trump has come to define their entire political life. And so one other thing I'd be looking at is, can these protests, veer younger? Not just, kids of parents, but, getting 20 and 30-year-olds out as well. And you look at these pictures and you're not quite seeing that. That's not the most scientific way to look at it. But I do think that, the extent to which young people are coming out is something that's a weakness right now and needs to be focused on too.
Well, it's interesting because older Americans tend to be much more politically active than we traditionally younger Americans. And it does beg the point, what's being done on that front to address younger Americans that, when we think economically, are being adversely affected by things like AI and are being effectively shut out of the job market in many cases. I think sort of taking in what you've seen today from the demonstrations here, the crowds, the signs, those No Keying banners that a lot of people have, what should civic action actually look like from here today?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to take action. Some of it is showing up in, local community meetings and just being in local community spaces. And again, Maryland has primaries, DC has primaries. There's states across the country that are going to have primaries. It's getting active in those campaigns. It is getting in touch with your local officials, your local members of Congress, but also local state reps, state senators, talking to them about issues that you care about. I do think that in addition to finding candidates that you care about, there is going to be an important role that individuals can play in protecting the sanctity of free and fair elections in 2026. And that can include becoming poll watchers, becoming nonpartisan election observers, which is something that happens in a lot of other countries and can happen here as well. And so really paying attention to to ensuring that the elections are free and fair and trusted. I think the other thing that people need to do, and you all are providing a service of this, is make sure that they're paying attention and getting news from reputable sources. This is, again, going back to young people. About 75% of young people are getting their news on social media, which is not necessarily a problem, but some of that can be not the most factual of news as well. And so making sure that you're getting non-biased news and that you're engaging friends and neighbors on that as well, I think is important. So part of it is just making sure that you're acting politically, not partisan, but politically every single day, in terms of paying attention, getting involved in local communities, and doing what you can to protect the sanctity of elections in 2026 too.
Scott, before we let you go, I just want to touch on something that you mentioned, because you've said it twice now. You've talked about elections. Do you have a legitimate concern that the policies that the Trump administration is trying to enact, that according to them, they say are going to strengthen elections in this country, do you feel that it will do otherwise?
I think that there is a reasonable case to make that the Trump administration is engaging in behavior that would erode trust in elections at the best, and there might be interventions that do more than that in the worst. The push to federalize elections in this country have always been locally run. That's a bedrock of our Constitution. You have it looks highly unlikely the SAVE Act will pass. But that's still going to be used by the Trump administration to say that there's undocumented immigrants voting, which is not happening. So I think that there's definitely the case that they're going to sow distrust. I think the good news is that elections in this country are still locally run. And so I've had the privilege and opportunity of meeting folks across the political spectrum that are running elections in Idaho, in Kansas, in Arizona, in Georgia, Wisconsin, that are doing an incredible job. And so I think that what gives me hope right now is that you have regularly everyday Americans that are running elections, and we need to provide them support right now. But I think that it can't be taken for granted that the administration sees midterms as existential. Democrats see these midterms as existential. Every election for the last few decades has seemed existential, and it means that there's a higher risk that there could be malevolent intervention in elections.
All right, Scott Warren from the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. We really appreciate your time and all your insight.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so we want to, I think, go to some video from Alexandria, Virginia. Of course, these protests happening all across the country today. 3,100 protests nationwide happening, dozens in our area too. We have seen the turnout so far, some of the images that are starting to come in. Millions of people are expected to attend, of course, rallying against President Trump's policies. And I mean, you can list them, what people are concerned about. I think different areas obviously concerned about different topics, from the higher cost of living to immigration to the war with Iran, obviously the impact of the economy that is now brought on a lot of people, gas prices. We have seen a dollar up from just a month ago. So certainly real issues that are impacting Americans all across the country.
And, you know, we also talk about election integrity. We have an election, or at least voting, that's taking place right now in the Commonwealth, voting on redistricting that's going on. There's some concerns, having talked with Democrats within the party in the Commonwealth, that not enough Democrats are actually showing up to the polls right now to vote on this redistricting effort. We've seen ads from former President Barack Obama trying to get Democrats to go out and turn out the vote. We will see what impact that will have. And potentially today we'll actually get more people to go out and not only register, but also participate in the electoral process.
Yeah, and I think that is the big thing that remains to be seen is, again, this momentum. We're seeing this turnout today. We have seen these rallies in the past, in October, last June, but what will that actually bring as far as bringing people out to the polls, to policy changes, and what will that look like?
Well, and you know, Marcella, I think you bring up a good point about that, because let's actually think about what's changed from the last time we had this rally to now. Nothing. Right?
What people are protesting.
What people are protesting, right? Yeah.
And because you know, if you look at this time last year, June, you've covered this extensively, the federal layoffs that were impacting so many people, especially in our area. And now you've added the war in Iran, you've added all the immigration issues that people are concerned about, and obviously the higher cost of living. And so you really have just added to the list. But again, the big question is, what have we actually seen as far as change?
Yeah, no doubt we need some policy wins on that front if they are to see this through. With that, I want to get to Congressman Don Beyer, who represents Alexandria. Let's take a listen to what he had to say earlier.
It's just wonderful to see this much energy in the citizenry. You know, the people are really upset with what's happening in Iran, what's happening with TSA, and this is their way to express that. You know, freedom of speech is an essential part of the American experience, and now we're exercising it. These rallies that had maybe 1,700 the last time, and now it's up to 3,100. So it just shows that people don't like the direction that Donald Trump is taking this country. And we're still months away from an election, but this is how we fight back in the meantime. We don't like this unnecessary war of choice, that we don't like the way ICE is assaulting American citizens, that we don't like the tariffs. We want him to be a good president. I mean, even if we didn't vote for him, we want the country to move in the right direction. It reminds people that there are ways to fight back. You know, we have a long history of protests through the country, including the civil rights and everything else. So this is a way that we say, we don't like the direction, we're going to do our best to change it. We're going to do it legally and peacefully. We'll do it through the electoral system. We'll do it holding up signs on street corners. And you know, it's cold, and the sun keeps going behind the clouds, but I don't see anybody going home yet. This is really exciting. This is what it means to be an American, to exercise our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly, and our way to fight back against the things we don't like the president's doing.
You know, luckily, we have seen many of the demonstrations that have been taking place today have largely been peaceful. The information from organizers to those that have been participating today, telling people to de-escalate any sort of situation that pops up, because they don't want this to get out of the hand, and they do want this to be a peaceful assembly.
Because I think that takes the message away from it when it doesn't become that. Joining us now, I think we want to go to Ford O'Connell, a Southwest Florida-based businessman, lawyer, and political communications expert.
He's a former Republican congressional candidate, a longtime GOP campaign operative, and a political analyst who has appeared on outlets including Fox News, Fox Business, Newsmax, and News Nation as well. Mr. Ford, thank you so much for being here. So let's get started with the big picture. There are a lot of concerns about the positioning of the Trump administration and its policies. Clearly, we have thousands of people spread throughout the country that are protesting in opposition. Set the scene for us right now. Is the Trump administration on the right course?
Well, right now, I would say that if the midterms were held today, the Democrats would probably retake Congress. I do think the point of the rallies, though, this idea of no kings, I think that honestly, these are Trump derangement therapy sessions for a lot of base liberals. And what they're pushing are lies and not any facts whatsoever. They'll say things like this is an illegal war or ICE is a rogue operation. All of it is a lie, but it is firing up the Democrat base.
I mean, I think you can't ignore the amount of people that have shown up so far, at some of these protests. What do you say, and what does it tell you about the political landscape that we're dealing with right now? And we had asked a previous guest too, is there any room for common ground at this point?
Well, it doesn't seem to be that there is any room for common ground, because essentially we're talking about a government shutdown right now that the Democrats have decided that because they want to abolish ICE, they're going to hurt TSA workers. Look, if Donald Trump were truly a king, there wouldn't be a shutdown and these protests wouldn't be able to happen. What I do think is Republicans have to understand that the 2026 midterms is an all hands on deck moment.
Well, there's some concerns from members on Capitol Hill that Republicans will perform poorly. Early elections that have been taking place around the country have shown that Republicans have been underperforming and have been doing so significantly, even in areas that are Republican strongholds. Does this demonstration today and the sort of elections that we've seen over the past couple of weeks represent a bit of a warning sign for Republicans in terms of what potentially lies ahead come November?
Yeah, I do think it is a warning sign. That's why I'm saying that it's an all hands on deck moment. These protests don't concern me as much because most of them are occurring in what I call liberal strongholds. But these special elections are certainly a warning sign where basically Donald Trump and the Republican Party have to get the same people that voted for Trump in 2024 to turn out in the 2026 midterms. That's a lot of younger men and low propensity voters who don't tend to turn out in midterm elections. That's why the Republicans are actually considering holding a midterm convention, which would be the first of its kind.
And as far as next steps, right, we are seeing these large gatherings, these demonstrations from here on out for Republicans. What are the next steps for you all? I know we've talked about Democrats and can they keep this momentum and movement into the midterm elections, into actual policy change? But from your perspective on the other side of the aisle, what should we be looking out for in the next couple of weeks and months?
Yeah, I think between now and November, the Republicans have to do two things: deliver on Donald Trump's two promises of prosperity, the economy, basically bringing down gas prices once the Iraq conflict ends, and security. What a lot of people don't seem to understand is as much as Democrats hate ICE, the American public agrees with Donald Trump when it comes to deportation of illegal aliens. It's about prosperity and security. And if Republicans can deliver on that, they may be able to hold the House of Representatives in November.
A quick clarification on the issue of ICE. Democrats are not actually calling for the abolishment of ICE. They are calling for policy changes that they say.
That is not.
Let me finish, sir.
When you listen to what
they are calling for
changes,
policy changes that they say will make it safer for ICE to operate in communities, so that they are not deaths of Americans as the two documented deaths that we had in Minnesota.
Is the same guy who ran ICE under Barack Obama and was given a medal. If you listen to the policy changes they're pushing for, they're essentially saying let's neuter ICE. This is no different than defund the police. And how did that work out for Democrats?
Well, are these changes necessary? I mean, considering the fact that we've had 2 people die in Minnesota, those deaths have really rocked the country. Given what we've seen take place in Minnesota, doesn't it warrant a review, potential changes that could allow ICE to do its job effectively and make sure that the public is also safe?
Look, it's unfortunate when anyone dies, but let's remember they were interfering with federal operations. And yes, Donald Trump is willing to make changes to ICE, but not do it at a gunpoint when it comes to a federal shutdown. We can have those conversations, but if you read bullet point by bullet point what the Democrats are pushing for, particularly when it comes to judicial warrants versus administrative warrants, you'd never be able to deport anyone. And Joe Biden let in 10 million illegal aliens because he refused to enforce Title 8 of the Immigration Nationality Act that's been on the books for decades. ICE isn't doing anything different than it did under Trump versus Obama. The difference is Donald Trump's in charge and it's being driven by Trump derangement syndrome.
When we talk about kind of the landscape that we're looking at right now, you mentioned this. I mean, people's livelihoods really being affected, trickling down to the airports. You have this partial government shutdown. People are out here. We have seen the images showing up all across the country, upset about the immigration tactics, the cost of living, federal layoffs, the war in Iran. From a other side of the aisle here, in Republican perspective, what are some of, in your opinion, President Trump's successes? You have people who are very upset about the way policies and things have gone over the last year or so. So what do you all consider, and Trump supporters consider, as part of his successes right now?
11 months of no illegal immigrants being let into the country through the border. The fact that we actually had the lowest gas prices in 5 years. He's actually stabilized inflation. He's delivering on what I was talking about, prosperity and security. But I think the key here is to wrap up the Iran conflict as quickly as possible, because that is going to lead to lower oil prices, which will create more affordable living. Remember, it was Joe Biden that drove up the inflation, and it's Donald Trump who's fixing the problem.
We're getting estimates from Congress and from the federal government that inflation could be as much as 4% this year. One of the big issues that we heard on the campaign trail in the last cycle was this issue of affordability. Groceries are up, gas is up, unemployment is up. Tariffs are also creating a burden on small businesses and large businesses alike. Help me out here. When we talk about sort of the wins of the Republican Party, people first want to make sure that they can put food on the table, keep a roof over their head, and be able to have a job to go to. With everything that we're seeing right now, a lot of Americans are a bit concerned about what the Republican Party is doing, how they're impacting the economy, and how for many, they say, the Republican Party is making it a lot more difficult for them to take care of their families and to do well.
Well, I think that they seem to forget what happened before Donald Trump came into office. Obviously, I think a key thing to make things more affordable was to wrap up the Iran conflict. But oil and gas is still cheaper under Donald Trump, and inflation is far lower under Donald Trump. In fact, he stabilized it under 3%. I mean, we were as high as 9% at one point under Joe Biden. I do agree with you. It's about the perception of affordability, and that is why gas prices have to return to pre-conflict Iran conflict levels by Memorial Day. And if you do that, then things will become more affordable. Remember, everything in our economy, goods and services, touches oil and natural gas. And the cheaper oil and natural gas is, the more affordable things are for the American people. And frankly, it's Donald Trump who's actually producing more oil and gas than we've ever had in American history. So he's on the right path. He just needs to speed it up.
Well, I mean, you're talking about oil and gas, but that's not the only indicator when we think about a healthy economy. Tariffs also play a role in that as well. Businesses large and small around this country have been fighting back against the Trump administration and their tariff policies. The Supreme Court has also weighed on the issue as well. People want to see it rolled back. The courts are getting involved. People are filing lawsuits by the thousands against the Trump administration. Yet these tariffs remain, and they are having an adverse impact on people at the grocery store, because the higher those tariffs are, the more it costs for goods and services at home.
Two things about the tariffs. In the first term, when Trump put down tariffs against China, it was amazing. The Biden administration kept them in place. And I promise you, two people that are holding these No Kings rallies in Minneapolis, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, would certainly support the tariffs, because you're protecting the American worker. You're trying to onshore jobs. And yes, the Supreme Court did knock down some of his tariffs. They didn't say you couldn't do the tariffs. You just cannot do it through this mechanism. So let's remember that the tariffs are about protecting the American worker and bringing jobs back to America, rather than just cheap consumer goods for the rest of the world. Remember, we have tariffs because China is trying to destroy America economically.
All right, well, give me the math here. How do you square that tariffs help secure jobs when businesses are having to pay for tariffs? It is costing them more, trickling down to consumers. They are concerned about the impact that this is having on their business, because it's directly cutting to their profits that they need to fund and support jobs. Square that math up for me.
That's very simple. It's about basically onshoring jobs by helping the American worker. We've been losing jobs left, right, and center in the private sector to China and the rest of the world. And the tariffs were a one-time thing. Remember, the stock market went bonkers the first time he set down the tariffs this term, and all of a sudden they adjusted. What we're seeing with the economy has more to do with the war in Iran than it does with tariffs right now. And that's the entire point. It was a one-time price hit. And it continues that way because we see it in stabilizing inflation. Everything economically is far stronger under Donald Trump than it was the previous 4 years.
And I think from what we've heard and what Larry just mentioned, I mean, we have heard these promises on the campaign trail. And I would like to get kind of a clear answer from you as to how that is all justified with the things that we are seeing right now, with making it cheaper to live. That was the promise, right? And that is the complete opposite of what we are seeing right now for many Americans who voted for President Trump and who did not vote for President Trump. So what are the next steps so that we can see some kind of... Well, let me finish. What are the next steps here that we can see to get to that point where people can feel like that promise was fulfilled?
Well, they're going to see it on tax day on April 15th when they actually get sizable returns back from the federal government. And essentially, we've stabilized inflation. So remember, once prices go up, they never come down. They can only be stabilized. And the way that we're running oil and natural gas in particular is what is going to bring about that affordability. I'm telling you, the only wrench in the problem right now is this conflict in Iran. And what the president is saying is, look, give me 50 days of pain and we're going to have 50 years of economic success in America, because essentially Iran won't be holding the rest of the world hostage.
And you mentioned the war in Iran here, saying that we need to wrap it up quickly, but we are kind of getting different stories here. That it was only going to be a few weeks, and now it's really an unclear timeline, potentially boots on the ground. Where do we stand with all of this? And kind of break that down for us.
We are only 28 days into it, so you said a few weeks. We seem to still be on a few weeks. There are no boots on the ground, and essentially Donald Trump is not starting a war. He's ending a war that began 47 years ago when Iran basically took over the U.S. embassy. It's been killing U.S. service members in the Middle East for decades. I mean, he's not starting a war, he's ending a war. And I think that a lot of people in America are not privy to that, thanks to legacy media, glossing over and trying to make it look bad for what Donald Trump is doing. He's been the peace president. He's ended 8 conflicts, and this will be the 9th.
So where is the peace in this? Because now, because of the war that we've engaged in, along with Israel against Iran, we have seen Iran retaliate against its neighbors in the UAE, causing economic disruption in that part of the world as well. Where is the peace? Where is the stability?
It's amazing you bring that up, because UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman are all agreeing with the United States and Israel. That's kind of amazing when you think about it. Iran has no allies. In fact, you even have the Russians saying that Iran needs to find a diplomatic solution to end it. And the fact that Pakistan, which is controlled by China, is basically trying to mediate tells you that Russia and China want Iran to stop it too.
Well, there's some really concerns about this war, primarily because of the Americans that we've lost up until this point. There's a concern that with additional Americans there, that we will lose even more lives. And this war is becoming increasingly unpopular for the administration. That potentially could have blowbacks when we think about the midterm elections coming up in November.
Well, look, nobody ever wants to see any American service member die. But I will say in the 4 weeks that we've been in Iran, this has been the most efficient, dominating air power campaign in the history of the United States. And I'm like you, I want to see it wrap up as soon as possible. So I think we're in agreement that it needs to end as soon as possible. But we are where we are at the moment.
President Trump has real concerns that he could potentially lose the House and the Senate in November. Republicans have sort of started at least planning for that. What do you want to see from this administration? What do you want to see from the president moving forward after today and these demonstrations?
Deliver on what I was talking about originally, which is he's delivered on security. I mean, we have the lowest murder rate since 1900 in American history. We have the most secure border in American history. We're doing well on the security front. What we need to see a little bit more of is the economic pickup and prosperity, because, again, we can argue numbers all day long, guys, but it's how the American voter feels when they go into the voting booth in November. And what I would say is, if I'm Donald Trump, I'd make the real point in this. Why would you turn the keys back to the car of Congress over to the very people that put you in this situation? That is going to be the key question in November. And if anyone can drive that home, it would be Donald Trump.
And Ford, before we let you go, I just want to ask you, when we talk about the protests happening today, what is the message? How are Republicans receiving that message of millions of people coming out across the country and sharing their concerns? How is that being received on the other side of the aisle?
Well, I think what happens is what you're saying is how polarized the country is. Because when I look at these protests, I look at them nothing more than Trump derangement syndrome therapy sessions. At the same time, though, that has to worry me come November, because I have to make sure in midterm elections it's base versus base. If I'm a Republican, I have to make sure that the base of my party is fired up as the Democrats. Because what these protests show me is I've got millions of pissed off Democrats, and you better counter them at the ballot box, or you're going to lose the United States House of Representatives. You're not going to lose the United States Senate.
All right. Well, the demonstrators are fired up, and so is Ford O'Connell. We appreciate you being here with us, sir. Good to see you. Thank you so much. Have a good day, okay?
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Now we want to go out to Matt Gregory, who is live at the, again, National Mall. Protests all across the country. Alexandria, we had footage from there. Yeah. Maryland and Germantown, where Sarah Robertson was. And there we go, Matt Gregory live on the National Mall there. I want to ask you, kind of set the scene for us. What does the turnout look like so far? And what are people saying, what has brought them out today?
Yeah, okay, so we're actually on the south end of the Frederick Douglass Bridge, and what's kind of this new bridge community that's being built over here. And this is where the No Kings rally is taking place. that's going to be marching into the district from the outside. We already saw one earlier, right, from Arlington into the mall. This is one kind of coming up and going to Fort McNair. But I'm going to show you a little bit what we're seeing. This is where the speeches are taking place right now. We've seen a few, activists from the district itself starting off talking about these things. But if you can kind of look here, there's hundreds of people. If you want to pan, Jack, I mean, there's a couple of signs that are a bit. We can't have them on television, so we're just going to ask Jack to spin quickly this way. Jack, give me a shot down there. The speeches, the audience goes all the way back down that way. If I had to guess, right, we're in the hundreds, possibly 1,000 or so right here. I'm actually surprised we have a signal right now. But this is what we're seeing, and I've been talking to some activists, right? We've seen, some federal worker activists. We've seen LGBTQ activists. We've seen a whole community of people come together, different sort of platforms, right, but all gathered together under this umbrella of this No Kings rally. So what's going to happen is speeches are going to go on here for another like 40 minutes or so, but then they're going to march from here across the Frederick Douglass Bridge and then over to Fort McNair. And everyone here that we've seen, it's very different from all the protests I've covered in the past. That it's very peaceful. People are actually quite happy. There's people dancing around as frogs, things like that. Like it's a very much a patchwork quilt of DC and maybe the DMV as well. So they've got different speeches going on from different groups that'll be talking, and then later on marching across there. We'll be following this throughout the afternoon or so on. And we're going to have a new speaker coming up in just a second. When you come back to us over the next couple of minutes or so, we'll let you dip in and kind of hear a little bit more of the speeches. But for now, this is what we're seeing in Southeast D.C., about to be the way going across, as I said, the Frederick Douglass Bridge, and we'll be among them. But for now, Southeast, I'm Matt Gregory. Back to you guys in the studio.
Hey, Matt, before we let you go, because this question has come up time and time again, what are the demonstrators today going to do after today to ensure the things that they're advocating for, the things that they don't like, get changed?
So that's one of the messages. Sorry, I should have brought that up, right? One of the things they're talking about, Larry, is they're saying, yes, this is important to be here today, important to continue galvanizing, to keep the momentum swinging in this direction, right? It's, a kind of a clever slogan, right? No kings, and that, like, who could be against that if you're an American? So they're able to galvanize all these groups underneath of this, but what do you do after that? So the conversation today is about moving forward to May, right? To the primaries, to June, and getting candidates on the ballot they say will support the America they want to see. That's part of it. But then the other part is continuing the momentum, as one labor union rep told us, continuing that momentum into November. And doing these rallies is seen as its own sort of like voting rallies, so to speak, right? Like you'll see people kind of galvanizing here over today and then into May and then into the summer. But if they want to keep the momentum up, as they feel that real change can be made at the ballot box going into the summer, for the primaries, then into the fall. So that seems to be their message to folks is, yes, come out today, be outraged, be upset, but do something about it. So, yeah, Larry, that's what we're kind of seeing over here.
Gregory, we appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
All right, and if you are just joining us, we are streaming live at WUSA9 Plus, our coverage of the No Kings protest rallies all across the country. More than 3,000 planned, and of course dozens here in our area, so we're going to keep you up to date on all of that. We've got video in Arlington of protests happening there. We have seen Alexandria. You just heard from Matt Gregory there in the district, and you can see here some footage, the signs. This is what democracy looks like. Obviously, people very concerned about the state of democracy, where this country is heading, and just protesting a number of issues from immigration to the cost of living to the war in Iran and just the impacts that we have seen on Americans over the last year or so.
Yeah, I mean, they're legitimately concerned about what they say are threats to democracy, that based on the sort of overreach, as some have described it, of the executive branch, that they feel that sort of democracy as we know it is in trouble. Also citing what they say are a lack of checks and balances coming both from Congress and from the judicial branch as well. Those are critiques that we hear from some. Republicans on the other side see this differently, say that the president is fulfilling many of the promises that he did on the campaign. They said that they would move forward with tariffs. They've done it. They said that they were going to make sure people would get kicked out of the country if they weren't here illegally. It's happened. So those are some of the policy wins that the administration is certainly proud of, and they continue to build on that as well.
Yeah, and I think the big question and concern that a lot of people have is, how far does this reach go? What is the level of power that the president should have. And some believe that he has, like you said, overreached and overstepped that. So obviously the turnout that we are seeing now expected to be the largest protest and rally in history. Millions of people expected across the country. Again, you are taking a look at video right now in Arlington, walking across the Arlington Memorial Bridge. We saw some of the images come in earlier. Aerial views really was incredible to see the amount of people that filled the bridge there earlier this morning. But again, those protests started some 10 o'clock this morning and are expected to last through the afternoon. Speeches, we are hearing people talk about some of their concerns. You can read the signs: no kings, no war. And certainly the turnout is impressive, but as we've been talking about all afternoon, is the steps and what's going to happen next.
Yes.
What happens tomorrow? We again have seen these protests happen in June, in October, today again, and what is the clear message and what is the plan of action after this? Because you do have to keep that momentum going and turn it into something. And as you heard our first guest say, you can't keep planning these protests if people don't see an outcome. And why would people want to come out to protest if they're not going to see a result of those protests and them taking their time away from their families and their jobs to come out and make sure that their voices are heard if we're not seeing an actual outcome.
Right. I mean, nothing has changed from the last time we had the No Kings rally to now, except the circumstances. We're now in a war. We are now still continuing to deal with tariffs. We are now dealing with sort of increased immigration enforcement that's been going on. The circumstances haven't all changed. Gas prices are on the rise. And what we've yet to hear from organizers with No Kings and others, what is the plan? What are you going to do? What does that look like? How are you going to get Congress involved in that? What are you doing on your local communities to see it through? We've yet to get any of those sort of substantive answers. And that just seems maybe to some to be a bit of a waste of time, that you're out here making noise on the street, you're dressed up, you have these signs, and then you go home and then you do nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think we have seen the trickle-down effect from all of this. You've got frustration that, people on Capitol Hill cannot come to an agreement. We have seen this partial government shutdown going on for weeks now, TSA agents without pay. That has obviously impacted the airports. Just this morning, we're reporting on BWI, 4 hours is what they're recommending that people come before their flights. These agents are calling out sick. They're trying to support their families, and yet we have no resolution on Capitol Hill, but they've gone on break, right, for the holidays. So I think that is where a lot of the frustration lies too, and is where we're going to see some common ground and finally some compromise.
Then one of the questions that we asked one of our earlier guests, Scott Warren, is common ground a thing of the past, right? He said no, that he still holds out hope that things eventually will sort of come together again, but I don't think we've seen common ground in a while, and it's sort of a foreign concept up until this point. So. All right. Let's go to Sarah Robinson. She's joining us from Germantown right now with a rally out there. Sarah, let us know what you're seeing. What are people telling you?
Well, I can definitely say that the vibe here is very peaceful. You can hear some music behind me. There were people singing and dancing. They were just chanting a bit ago. But there are hundreds of people out here. I want to show you the crowd size that we're looking at. This rally in Germantown started around 12. I believe it's expected to go until about 2:30. But we were also at another location this morning in Riverdale Park, Maryland. That's about a 40-ish minute drive from here. That one was from 10 to noon. And at both locations, we saw hundreds of people lining the streets, as you can see here now, encouraging people to honk, to slow down. There's a lot of people here with signs, as I'm sure you can see. We've also seen some inflatable costumes. Those costumes, I believe, were made popular in Oregon at some protests last year, or early this year, I should say, in Oregon. But really, people say that they want their voices heard. They are struggling, they say, with what is going on in this country. Take a listen.
ICE in our neighborhoods.
The American dream that our parents promised to us really seems to be slipping away in both a financial sense.
It's just horrifying that we started a war with Iran.
Immigration enforcement, the economy, and the war in Iran. 3 key concerns driving hundreds of Marylanders out today for the third No Kings Day protest against President Donald Trump. Across the country, more than 3,000 demonstrations are planned nationwide, organized by activist groups Indivisible, Move On, and the ACLU.
For me, it's important to, gather around and realize that we have the power to make change impossible.
In Riverdale Park, along Route 1, people of all ages and backgrounds line the street, urging their neighbors to take action.
I just wanted people to know that you can vote in your primary on June 23rd if you're a Maryland resident.
Others say even if change feels uncertain, showing up still matters.
Well, he's broken all kinds of laws. So for real, we don't know. Just being honest, he's broken all kinds of laws. He does it continuously and no one does anything. So maybe he will come back.
I think that there's a lot of strength in community.
Now over here you can see some flags. They're in this area. Before you guys came to me, there was a speech going on, and they hit on a lot of the talking points that you guys have been chatting about this afternoon. The economy, they've talked about immigration, but really they talked about what people can do after this point, because there have been a series of No King's Day protests and people want to know what they can do that's going to move the needle. And they were really talking about voting, how important it is to make sure that you're registered to vote, how important it is to make sure that you show up to your primary and to the midterm later this year. And something that I touched on a bit in that piece that you just heard, but a lot of people are really driving home the issue of the economy. They tell me that Trump ran on lowering grocery prices, lowering gas prices, but they tell me that it's harder to pay for gas, it's harder to put food on the table, and they're not sure what to do. One gentleman that you heard talk to me about, he was raised with this idea of the American dream, which means being able to provide for your family, and he was mentioning that he's not sure that he could do that for children that he plans to have in the future. Guys?
Sarah, I want to ask you, before we came to you earlier, I had asked about counter-protesters. Is that something that you're seeing at this point into the rally, or what has kind of the mood and the vibe been like?
Yeah, well, the vibes here are high. I would say there are people singing and dancing. We've heard some Bob Marley songs. It has been completely peaceful. Everyone has been in a pretty pleasant mood, although they are definitely passionate about the issues that they are here protesting. We have heard about counter-protesters being not necessarily in this area, but just that they exist today. I, myself, and our team, we have not seen any. But of course, if that changes, we'll be sure to let you know.
Sarah Robinson, thank you so much. We do want to get to a message from the White House that we've gotten their response to the demonstrations today. And this statement from Abigail Jackson, a spokesperson for the White House, saying this, that the only people who care about these Trump derangement theory sessions are the reporters who are paid to cover them. So that's the official response from the White House about the No Kings rally taking place today. All right.